Hi everyone. As promised, this video is going to be much more MBTI substantial. I'm going to be focusing on things that I've observed and things to think about when you're trying to evaluate whether you have more of a preference for judging, so-called judging, or so-called perceiving on the Myers-Briggs Temperament Indicator scale, having to do with the general approach to everyday living, shall we say. First, a bit about who the heck am I? I am some schmo who has been really interested in the MBTI for most of 20 years and who's done a lot of research on it in reading, but also a lot in terms of discussion and talking with a great many people about it and helping them figure out what their preferences are and so on. So that's what I'm drawing on, both of those things, the sort of lived experience in the social, what I would call the sort of MBTI lab of my life, and as well as the research. So I'm going to focus on the J and P one today, J versus P. And the first thing I'd like to say is sort of a general principle I think that should be kept in mind whenever you're trying to do your own self-typing, your own evaluation, or also when you're trying to help somebody else figure out what their preferences are if they've asked you to do so, they've asked for your input. I think it's really important as a principle to try and direct your thinking towards what you tend to do or what you tend to choose, what you tend to prefer when choosing one way of doing things over another. The more sort of the judger's way of doing things versus perceiver's tendency in doing things and preferences. Really, it's important to sort of screen out situations where there's going to be any kind of discernible benefit to going one route or the other. I think that would really help a lot, and it would prevent a lot of mistyping and misleading, because really when it comes down to it, these are temperamental preferences that we're talking about. So it's a bit, it could be invalid if you are evaluating whether you're a judge or a perceiver when there are other things in play besides your temperamental preferences, such as whether or not you'll get a promotion as a result of building up this behavior, or whether or not you'll get someone who's the approval of someone who's important to you, or whether or not you'll live up to your own image of an ideal of what you want to be, you wish to be, what you're striving for. These are all ways that we can kind of get in our own way of self-typing correctly. So when I do my little quick tests, which maybe I'll just do a video entirely about that, but I sort of have it's a real sketch, but I have a little quick test for the Myers-Briggs when I'm just having a casual conversation with someone and about the thing, and they become interested in it, and they're like, "Oh, what do you think I am?" I will sort of start very often with this quick test that I do, and my quick test. One of the things that I'll ask in the sort of quick test for figuring out, trying to tease out whether someone's preferences are more on the judger end of the scale or the perceiving end, more open-ended scale, is to once again emphasize, as I'm asking any of these questions, what would you be more likely to do 51 times out of 100, because 51 times out of 100 is significant in this model. Once again, there is no midline in the MBTI. It is not possible to have an equal preference. So we're trying to figure out what that is. And one thing I'll ask people is, do you tend to feel more often anxious to make a decision and come to closure and move on about things? Or do you tend to more often feel anxious in terms of feeling pressured to make a decision before you feel like you've done the full amount of information gathering that you could ever hope to do before you make a decision? Are you worried that if you don't have more research time before making an important decision, that maybe you'll have missed something, or maybe new information is going to come in at the 11th hour or just after you've committed to something that will change everything and make you regret the decision? What is your sort of more often the emphasis of your worries? Is it an emphasis that you're not going to do it promptly enough, and then maybe an opportunity will slip through your fingers, or it just will be a less than optimal outcome if you don't? Are you just like, please, let's make a decision and move on? Or do you tend to be more anxious about, don't push me to commit before I'm ready to commit, because I need more time to really think about it and gather more information and make sure that I've really considered everything that I should. Now, of course, whether people have the judging preference or the perceiving preference, they will be able to, at different times to it, if they're at all a healthy, functioning adult human who's independent in their lives to any degree, then they will be considering both of those things quite often, and it's going to be unheard of, basically, that you don't do both quite often. But what we're trying to find out is what is the tendency, what is the slight tendency even, in terms of your preferences and the way you prefer to go about doing things. And again, I ask you to try and think of, wherever possible, put that question to yourself: when there would be no bad consequence to going one route or the other. Again, if you're having trouble figuring this out, and this goes for trying to figure things out on any of the 4 scales, I really suggest that you really think about that. You try if you can to put questions to yourself about concerning different kinds of situations in everyday life, where, if you're being really rational about it, you have to admit that it doesn't really matter one way or the other, like to the outcome. Whether you make the decision very, very quickly, or right away as soon as you hear that there's a decision to be made, or if you let it sit for a couple of days. What would be your tendency 51 times out of 100? So that's sort of the general sort of attitude that I would encourage people to have as they're putting these kinds of questions to themselves. Now, there could be a whole lot. There is a lot more to it, depending. You can get into a lot more complexity than this, but it seems to me that the main sort of elements of the judging preference versus the perceiving preference, some elements of it that are really important have to do with one's attitude to time, one's attitude to drudge stuff, and the way in which drudge maintenance necessary tasks that are generally not considered to be the greatest time to accomplish. What is one's, again, tendency and attitude towards getting those things done. Another element would be planfulness. So again, the how often and how would come into play, and I'll get into more detail about all these in a moment. And the fourth would be organization of one's environment. In my silly mini-series Positive ID in episode 4, I talked about what I notice in some differences between judgers' fashion and self-presentation visually versus, I didn't talk about what the perceivers were so much, but mostly focused on the INJs and certain specific things that I saw there. But I also, in doing so, I talked about sort of judger stuff. Well, now in this video, I'm going to go into how it is that if I'm in an open concept office where it's everybody's desks are out in the open, I really can, with a good degree of accuracy, go around and 8 out of 10. 4 out of, I can go and say, that's a judge, very quickly, I'm like, that's a judger, that's a perceiver, that's a judger, that's a perceiver. And feel pretty confident about that if I have access to other things, if I have been able to spend some time with that person and ask them some questions or hear about how they do things when their time is their own. That's a very important caveat. Or when they speak plainly about what their preferences are. And I should always, none of these things are standalone as assessments. Any sort of assessment should always take into account multiple factors. And of course, you can't go wrong with starting with examining the cognitive functions and what they are all about, and also how, what your preferences are according to your cognition. But the thing is, I also think that some valuable information can come from the exterior, because cognition always leads to action. The cognition is patterned, so is the action to a great extent. So I am not one to discount the potential helpfulness of looking at patterns in behavior. as some kind of, again, in the presence of other kinds of evidence, many other items of evidence and many different kinds of evidence, I think that that kind of information has a part to play in giving people clues as to what their preferences are. I don't think those things should be discounted. All right, so let's look at attitude to time. So it really is the case that people who are more on the perceiving end of the spectrum for the scale, judging versus perceiving, the attitude to time really does tend to look at time as almost a renewable resource, as nutty as that may seem to the judgers. There's just tends to be a much looser sense of it, a sense of perhaps unwarranted in many cases, but a sense of like that things can be arranged in many different ways. There are many different alternatives, and there is not an assumption that every decision needs to be made as soon as possible and that's always the best way to go, which tends to be an attitude held by more judgers. Not all judgers, but that is a tendency. So whereas judges tend to be much more aware of time, they literally look at the clock more. They literally they apportion time. They schedule things in a more rigorous. They do it more frequently. They do it more rigorously. They tend to do it to a more detailed degree. So there's a sense of like, there's more. Again, it's as with everything in figuring out the preferences within this model. It's always everything is a matter of emphasis. Everything is relative. So if you're more on the judging end, then your emphasis is going to be more on anxiety about time running out, not having enough time, not making the most of the time that we have. So looking at time as a very limited resource and more through a lens of scarcity rather than abundance. Whereas P's, much, much looser sort of concept and attitude, much more relaxed about things like that. And a sense of like, quite vague. And, if you have quite a strong perceiver's preference, you might find yourself thinking things like, I'm sure we'll have time. We'll have time to do that later. I just feel this to be true. Or, I know that certain things can get done in a burst of energy at the end. So I'm not too worried about, a P person is much more likely to, go off some adrenaline closer to a deadline, for example, to get things done and then work extremely hard in a shorter period of time versus the way judges will tend to get things accomplished, which is if they have a large assignment that they need to do, they will tend to plan it ahead and do a little bit by bit, not get stressed at any point, just do a little bit over time to reach the goal. Whereas people with a perceiving preference will again, nobody does everything always, but perceivers, again, 51 times out of 100, they will tend to perhaps procrastinate it or put it off or just be more uneven about how they do it. They might schedule it, but then they'll change the schedule. They'll be more flexible about letting it go, and then we're doing double time on the next day because they didn't do it the day before. So there's just more changeability, more flexibility, more of a relaxed attitude to time. Now, number 2, attitude to drudge work and maintenance type activities. Very, very often the judgers will tend to really want to get necessary drudgy tasks out of the way as quickly as possible. So it is said of them that they tend to have more of a work ethic. Now, I want to qualify this a little bit because it's not that the perceivers don't have a work ethic, but it is the case that the judges do tend to have an attitude of is there something crappy but necessary and important that we have to do? Let's just do it now. And then maybe the perceiver will say to the judger, but we have weeks. And the perceiver may be right. There may be no ironclad reason that this drudgy thing needs to be done right now. It needs to be done up front. But the judger will often tend to want to do that. They'll want to get it out of the way sooner anyhow. Or that at least if they're not going to get it done right now, they want it scheduled so they know that when it will be done, and they certainly don't want it left to the last minute. They don't want that kind of stress. They have no tolerance for it. They don't want it. And they will probably take steps to ensure that does not occur. And they'll become more and more anxious as the deadline gets closer if they've not been able to accomplish the task in small pieces along the way in a measured and unstressed kind of way to get there. So there'll be that's a big one. I'll ask people about their decision making. Again, do you tend to feel more anxious before making a decision because you just can't wait to make the decision and go on, or get the task done and move on? Or do you tend to feel a little more anxious about being pushed into doing it really early, and you kind of that's what makes you anxious and unsettled and kind of resentful? Sometimes when you feel pushed to do it and you're like, look, like there's no reason why we have to decide so quickly. So why are we, why is there the pressure on to decide so quickly? So there is that. Whereas back to this sort of work ethic, it would be said of the perceivers, then there's more of a play ethic. There's more, and again, this does not mean that at the end of a project, if you were to see the log of the total hours put in, that the judges put in more hours. I mean, they might have put in fewer hours, but they did it in a more spread out, parceled out kind of way, in all likelihood. Whereas the perceivers might have done it in these big, like chunks, alternated with rest periods that were much longer than the J's would ever feel comfortable with. So a perceiver might be much more likely to put things off if it's really boring and drudgy and awful, and there is a lot of time to get it done. They will tend to push, more often, certainly more often than the people with the judging preference. They will opt to put off the heavy lifting longer. So that's another one. Now to planfulness. What I notice, and again, what I've read in the theory, or what I've read in lots of books rather on the MBTI that draw heavily on actual experience and interviewing lots of people of different types, and looking at behavioralisms and looking at self-reports and looking at self-reports as pertains to MBTI things. The judges will quite often, they will plan things. They will have all kinds of micro routines in their day. And they will have, they actually love to make plans. They tend to love to make plans, and they will make them. Again, this is very critical. Like, again, if you're sort of on the fence and you just don't know, and you're all confused about whether you're more on the J or the P end. Here's the thing about J's. Again, J's will usually relate to this in my experience when I've talked to them about how they like to do things. They really like to plan beyond what is strictly necessary to getting something done well. It's almost like people with a moderate to a strong judging preference. It's almost like they live to come to closure and move on. Come to closure, move on. They love to do it. They feel very satisfied and very well when they do that. And this goes well beyond the utility of such an action, although that, of course, that often is very useful. But their preference, this is how you can tell that it's a temperamental preference for these people, is that they want to do it even when there is no discernible benefit. Like when pressed, they have to admit there's no discernible advantage in terms of outcome to doing it that way. They just like to do it. So, for example, like when I've watched my judger friends when they go on a vacation, here's a very judger typical thing to do is to, if they've researched, they'll want to research what they're going to be doing day by day on their trip. And again, then all kinds of other factors come into play as to the exact how and what of what goes into these plans. But the thing is, they have a plan. Like they have a plan, they want a plan. And sometimes the plan also can involve open-endedness. Like they plan for that. They're like, well, I planned that for this afternoon, it'll be potluck. We'll see what happens. But I'll know something about where I'll be, and I'll know like what time is the free time. What time is the time to be spontaneous? So that's how a judger can sometimes, if you catch them in one of those windows, you might mistakenly think they're a perceiver because they just seem so relaxed and easygoing. But sometimes a judger seems so relaxed and easygoing precisely because they've planned, a block of time for their leisure or for open-endedness. And so then they fully enjoy it because they planned it, so they feel completely relaxed about being freeform for this evening or that, or this part of an afternoon or that. So one thing that I notice, all my judger friends, when I put this to them, they almost always laugh when I ask them this question, which is, and I think a lot of judges relate to this. This is a real behavioralism that they do. Do you ever make lists after you've accomplished a bunch of tasks just for the satisfaction of crossing them off? This is something really adorable that almost all the judges I know that I've asked the question of, they usually burst out laughing when I ask them that question, because they recognize that that's nuts. Like, they recognize that, strictly speaking, that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But I think it's because they like to do it. They do tend to make more lists. They do tend to make more schedules, or whatever. It's not that perceivers don't make lists or have calendars or make use of those kinds of tools, but the judges will tend to use them more often, refer to them more often, and they will tend to be very much more detailed. Tend to. Again, depends on the person and what they have in their life, and just how tightly organized things have to be, and also just how strong their judging or versus perceiving preferences are. But as a general rule, they love to make plans. They're good. And again, if you're a judger and you've been practicing for decades, you're well into adulthood, you've become very good at it. It's probably become a very developed skill on your part. So, and again, we all tend to love to exercise the skills that we have honed. So, judges are no different with that. Whereas the perceivers, again, we will tend to leave as many things open-ended as we can. And I'll speak as someone who has a moderate P preference, but definitely moderate. It's not one bit less than moderate, that's for sure. And I know, and when I've talked to my friends with the perceiver, many different kinds of types with the perceiver preference, something that most of us can relate to is that those of us with a moderate to strong P preference, nothing that we feel so panicked and awful and honestly, life might not be worth living. The idea that we could have every 5-minute block, or say 10-minute block of our lives mapped out for months in advance, whether we do it or somebody else does it for us, that we could know exactly where we will be and what we will be doing at 3:00 on a date 3.5 months from now, fills us with horror, an absolute horror. We have this, again, matter of emphasis, important matter of emphasis. If you have a P preference, then you need to have a certain amount of open-endedness in your schedule. Maybe you have a very, there's a lot of performance required from you, and you do need to live for example, you're someone who has a very demanding career that involves a lot of planning and a lot of coordinating of activities with others. And maybe you have children, and maybe you have other responsibilities. Maybe you're caring for an aging parent. Maybe you're involved in all kinds of community activities and extracurricular stuff. So maybe you need to be highly scheduled and extremely planful as a P person, because you need, that's just what's required to meet your goals. So even though it's not your kind of natural bent temperamentally, the pros and cons are such, as you weighed them out, indicate that it's worth it to you to go against your grain a bit, to plan like crazy. But every P person, though, will be aching at times to not know in advance what's happening. Quite often. I think of a couple I've known for a long time, an INFJ and an ENFP, and I thought this was really funny, a little story from their lives together. And they were together for a very long time, and something that would happen on a Saturday morning is that the INFJ, they wake up and they'd be lying in bed for a moment and just getting ready to get up. And the INFJ, of course, would be ready, usually would be ready to get up a lot earlier, get up, get out, get going a lot more earlier than the ENFP would. And the INFJ would ask the ENFP, so what are you going to do? What's up for today? What are you doing today? And a very typical kind of ENFP answer would be, probably if the P preference is quite pronounced, there would be, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. There would be maybe 7 or 8 activities, and maybe, 3 or half of those on a Saturday, if they're leisure activities, they're not completely essential. There's no big urgency about getting them done that day. Then the way a P will probably want to structure the Saturday is to have a few things with a fixed time, especially if they need to be, they involve other people to carry out some sort of task or accomplish something. But if it's left up to their own devices, they'll say, they might say something like, well, I'm going to do the laundry. I'm going to go shopping for I'm going to go grocery shopping. But a P will be much more likely to be very relaxed about, be deciding what's for dinner that night, just at home and doing it kind of on the fly or just before they go shopping. Whereas the J person's going to want to, again, they want things decided. They love to have things decided in advance and settled in advance, and then they can think about something else. But they love to do that, and they love to do that for its own sake in many cases. So this would be the thing. They'd be lying in bed talking about their day, and then the ENFP would ask the INFJ what he'd be doing, and he would have taken great joy. In fact, he was very strong J preference, so he would have had a lot of satisfaction in having very carefully planned the day out, at least the night before, probably even a few days before, depending on what he had in mind to get done. But he was relishing the idea of getting going on getting this done, and crossing that off the list, getting that done, moving on to the next thing, and would have a very structured idea of like, this is happening, and this is happening, and this is happening, and this is happening. And of course, this was a couple that worked very, very well and had a wonderful time together. But this would very often, if they had tensions, the tensions would be around the J and the P stuff, because the ENFP would constantly be sort of going like, get off of me, like we don't have to decide all that right now. I don't want to decide all that right now. It's making me feel really anxious because what if we miss something? What if we commit before and then we need to change our minds later? We want to change our minds later, and then it's too late. We're all boxed in. The INFJ had the opposite worry. And conceivably, in many situations, both could have been equally right. Both of them had a point. So just a matter of preference. Okay, so planfulness. Then the other part. Oh, there's another thing about planfulness that I've noticed. And this is a good question, I think, to tease out a judging versus perceiving preference with people. I ask people, like, if, let's say you had a plan with a friend, something that nothing of consequence in either of your lives was riding on, like a pure, like lighthearted, short-term, ad hoc kind of leisure activity, like going to see a movie together. A movie that, was going to be in the theaters for a long time. Let's say you had a plan to meet with your friend. And, maybe you'd made it a couple of weeks in advance, maybe you'd made it a few days in advance, whatever. And then let's say that someone had to change the plan a little bit, but not in a way that would, again, have any negative, deleterious consequence whatsoever. You still would get to see the movie. You still would see each other. Nobody had anything else. No one was going to be missing out on anything at all by changing the plan a bit, by, say, like moving the date up, an hour, or just reversing the order of two completely independent activities that were easy to change. They weren't dependent on other things in the environment or in other people's plans that might be disrupted by this change. There would be, if you're being rational about it, no negative consequence whatsoever to changing the plan. Now, I would say to the person, how in such a situation, if the plan were slightly changed, how would you feel? Would that bother you just at least a little bit? Would you just feel a little just a little itchy in your soul about that? Would you just feel a little unsettled, a little bit irritated, a little bit unnerved, a little bit maybe disappointed by the change in the plan? Or would you just feel like, I'd feel fine, wouldn't bother? Again, if I wasn't missing out on anything and it wasn't bothering anyone, it wasn't going to hurt anybody. It wasn't going to ruin anybody's plans. It wasn't going to disappoint anyone or make something not possible anymore that would have been possible otherwise. Would it not bother you? And very often the judges will admit that for them, the fact that there was a plan and then the plan got changed, especially if the plan got changed close to the time, they very often do feel a bit about it, a little bit bothered by that. They would have preferred that things just go according to the plan. On the other hand, the perceivers, this kind of thing wouldn't bother a perceiver usually whatsoever. It wouldn't have any meaning. It wouldn't have any negative meaning. It wouldn't have any meaning to it. It wouldn't have any, there would be no problem. There would be not even the tiniest bit of anxiety. It would be just absolutely nothing. It would be no problem. So that's one way you might be able to tell. And I'll say in my case, for example, being an ENFP, I love it when people cancel. Like in such a situation, if I put that same question to myself, I love it when people cancel plans. I mean, if I'm not going to be missing out on anything, let's say that the person who's canceled on me is someone that I still can see very soon. We can still spend the same amount of time together. We can still do the thing that we'd wanted to do. I actually love it when people cancel plans because my dominant extroverted intuition, cognitive function is so strong, and I have a moderate P preference. So when somebody cancels, then I get to do, then what that means to me is, oh, I still get to eat my cake, and I get to do what I love to do and what I'm fantastically good at, which is generate possibilities on the fly. That's one of the strongest, the biggest strengths that I have as an ENFP. So now I'm like, ooh, what'll I do now? Will I do this? Will I do that? Will I go see this other movie? Will I go see this other friend? Will I get that other fun thing done that I wanted to do? So I don't mind a change of plan whatsoever. In fact, I find it quite delightful sometimes when it happens. So that's a big one. Then the last part of the J, not that all there could ever be, but the only thing I'll cover in this video for now. I'll go into this stuff again more specifically and from other angles in upcoming videos. But the next one to consider, I think, a big sort of tenet is organization of the environment. There really can be a lot of clues to that. And I don't want to. I'll get into this I'll get into this in more detail in other things. But let's take, for example, looking at somebody's desk. Now, I did make the claim that very often I can tell a J from a P while they're in absentia, just from looking at their desk. Now, again, not that I could never be fooled or I'd always be right about it. Sometimes, for example, a judger's desk, I could catch them at a time where, say, they are. I could catch their desk at a time where it's particularly busy and where they've had to kind of go against, in order to meet higher goals, they've had to go against their own temperamental preferences for a short period of time. So maybe there's some accumulation of clutter on their desktop, or that wouldn't normally be there. Or maybe it is that judger's routine that they're still very much a judger. They still have that preference, but the way they do their organized micro routine of keeping their desk, maintaining their desk in a certain way, is their routine. Again, routine. J's always have way more routines in their day. And again, look for those if you're confused for your own preferences or whatever. Look for the routines that you maintain, even when there is no discernible benefit to doing them, but you just feel better when you do them that way. You do them the same way. You do them in this particular predictable way. You just like doing them like that. If you have a lot of little things about how you like to make your coffee and how you like to do this, how you like to do that, how you like your things arranged, and you just feel better when they're just really orderly and done just so, that's a very sort of judger attitude to the environment. And again, certain P people too don't be fooled. Sometimes some P people can be very particular about certain things. But we're looking at trends, again, all a matter of emphasis. We're looking at trends here. We're looking at broadly. We're looking at big picture. We're looking at multi-variables at once that are being all weighed in. It's like, what is the impression that you get if you look at all the data and you kind of squint, and look at it like this, and then what do you see? What are the trends that you see? That's the sort of way you should be approaching interpretation of the data. So organization of the environment. So in general, a judger, I'll just talk about the desk thing because I've seen it over and over and over and over again in different workplaces I've been in. I'm a freelancer, so I work in many different orgs at different sites, and most of them are firms where there's a lot of open concept workspace. So you really can just visually see people's workspaces very easily. They're just right there. We're all sharing this one big room or loft or whatever it is. So what I see is that in general, a J's desk is going to, again, big generalizations coming up, but we're looking for trends here. Usually a judger's desk versus most of the perceiver's desks, their desktops are going to have less stuff on them. Period. Just less stuff. And what stuff they do have is going to be usually the purpose of it being arranged, like there's an intentionality about the arrangement of the things on the desk that is greater with the judgers versus the perceivers' desktop spaces. The perceivers will be going more often with like, good enough, that's fine. I know where that is. I don't need to be fastidious about lining everything up and like, making things at right angles and creating extra categories or whatever. Like P's are going to be much more like good enough, just like they are with a lot of things in life. The judges are going to be, I can't feel right until I know it's the way that I like to do it. It's this particular way. So here's another thing, and this is going to say, again, some people are going to scoff at this, but I hope to be able to do, like, if it wouldn't get me in trouble, I'm going to go around and do what I call Exhibit J, and I'm going to go around to a bunch of actual real life desks and desktops. I'm going to show you what I'm talking about, with known quantities, with people who know what their types are and have confirmed it, and I'm going to show you what that looks like for the naysayers who think that there's nothing to this. I'm like, well, all right, I can prove it, and I will. But anyway, I can prove the trends. That's what I can prove. So a judge's desk will tend, and more often than not, versus most of the P's, they will literally have more right angles formed by the objects on their desks. You could actually get out a protractor and check it out. Things are more like this on a judge's desk more often, more of the time. A perceiver's desk too will have probably more mementos or just oddball things on it. Like when I see a desk, let's say I'm in a design firm and I see a designer's desk and they've got all kinds of little toys and they've got cute little objects, and then they've got a bunch of pictures, and they've just got more clutter around. That's not getting in the way. Like they still have, plenty of space within which to work on their desk, but around the periphery of that workspace, there are just little bits of things. In an extreme case for a P, there might be like a couple of coffee mug rings left on the desk for an hour or whatever. A lot of the judges I know, first of all, they would prevent the ring from happening. They would be very careful, like wipe under the mug, and they'd have a little micro routine about that to make sure it doesn't happen. And if it does happen, they will not, at the earliest, non-intrusive opportunity, they're going to clean that up because it will drive them crazy if they don't. Is it because the world will end or anyone will give a shit, the tiniest shit besides them about it? Probably not. But they will care about it, and they will want to take care of that. And then there's what I would call the dead pen test. All right. So very often J's too, they will have their stuff. They'll have kind of an innate sense of like, everything has a place and everything in its place. And, if they can put things out of sight and organized in the files or whatever, they will very often do that. They will keep the desk rather spare. And again, the stronger the J preference, the more spare will be the desktop in normal times. So here's the dead pen test that I would put forward. First of all, a J conceivably could have a jar of pens and pencils on their desk, but in my experience, they usually don't do that. Usually they have, again, they've got the little trough in the drawer. They've got some kind of system worked out for their writing utensils. So they will tend to have only what they need to work with in the moment on the desk, and the rest will be organized and put away and stored and out of sight and tidy and in the same place all the time. Once something gets used, it gets put away immediately. P people, much more relaxed about that and just much more oblivious to that kind of thing. Or they don't care. They're like, I don't care that it's not completely tidy. If I've got my jar of pens and pencils, that's fine. There it is. I know where it is, and I can see what's there, and it's not getting in the way of anything. So if somebody though if you go to somebody's jar of pens or pencils and you're to test them, okay, if there's one dead pen that's in that jar, or a pencil with the lead snapped off and there's not a refill, like it's just a useless thing now. If you find anything like that in such a jar, I think all of a sudden the odds that person is a perceiver have gone way up, way up. If you see in such a jar, if you find two dead pens, then it's like, the chances that person's a J has just gone way on down, unless it's like a communal space. If it's just that person's space, though. If you find 3 dead pens, like 2 dead pens and a broken pencil in a rather full, busy writing utensil jar on the desk or container on the desk, as far as I'm concerned, it's case closed. Like, that person cannot possibly be a J, because J's don't let that stuff happen. They don't. They just don't. So, anyhow, that's I'll wrap it up there. There'll be more to say about J and P and very specific instances coming up. But I hope for those who are wondering about how to discern the temperamental preferences on this scale, I hope that some of that material helped. And thank you very much for watching.